How's it going, folks? Welcome to yet another video. Today we'll be ranking every single Yakuza final boss, going from the easiest to the hardest. It's been a minute since I did a ranking video, and this video won't be in the format of a tier list, which I did plenty of already, but rather it'll be in a sequential order that will literally just go from the easiest final boss to the hardest. All, of course, according to my opinion and a bunch of other factors. But also, having said that, with a video like this, there's a lot of disclaimers to put out and things to keep in mind as I go through this list. Least of which is that there's so many variables here, like an insane amount of variables that can change how you perceive a given boss. But I'll try to narrow it down as best as I can and apply a condition or two. So, for example, we'll assume you have at least most acquirable abilities, and I'll try to consider the difficulty from the perspective of not just the first playthrough, but also for returning ones. But at the end of the day, this is a list that's coming from someone's opinion, and that means others may have had experiences that conflict with the placements of this list. Simply put, you may have experienced these bosses in a drastically different way than I have. This ranking assumes you're playing the game normally, not in a speedrun manner or a hardcore no damage manner, where you might know many tricks that the average player doesn't. I consider myself to be an above average player, but nowhere near, insanely skilled. I want to stress again and again, take some of these placements with a grain of salt, because many bosses feel samey in terms of difficulty levels, and at times, it just came down to a small factor deciding who comes after who. I'm really excited to do this video, especially after recently I kept asking people about their opinions on the hardest Yakuza final boss, and honestly, I went through a shock. It really just hit home how everybody really has vastly different experiences when playing these games, especially, once again, with how many variables there are, and how my list will probably conflict with what many people would have in their list, purely because I played through these games enough to the point where my opinion is just bound to be very different from many people. But anyway, there will be one special exception for who is truly considered the final boss for Yakuza 7, where you could easily argue that the true final boss is Tendo and not Masato. I'd normally try to avoid doing this and just go with the very final boss of a game, but Masato's fight was just very different in structure. It was there to give us the one and only QTE in that game that transitioned into the ending. However, that obviously doesn't mean I'll exclude a boss just because they're easy. In the case of multi-protagonist games, I will separate between each protagonist final boss and include all of those as well. So with a game like Yakuza 4, Arai, Kido, Daigo, and Munakata are all separate entries. I will also separate the Kiwami games from the originals because the fights actually differ enough for me to do that. Now, having said that, let's get to the ranking. Number 31, Tenkai, the final boss of RGG Kenzan. I know what some of you are thinking. Tenkai isn't the true final boss of Kenzan, that should be Kojiro. I understand where you're coming from, and if you were to consider Kojiro as the final boss in your list, fair enough. But let me explain why I made this choice. Both Kojiro and Tenkai are full-on proper boss fights where each of them have the same amount of health, that being 3 full boss health bars. If Tenkai was made in a way that's similar to Masato from 7, where it's more of a fancy outro rather than an actual systematic fight, I would have put Kojiro here. However, once again, the game devs gave Kojiro and Tenkai the same amount of health, and really the only difference here is just the moveset. Tenkai doesn't even have a QTE, just an animation at the very end where he falls off a cliff. So this fight is as gamey can get. But anyway, let's talk about the actual fight. This is probably the most brain-dead final boss in the whole franchise, and it's not even close. All this guy will do is just shoot at you with a flintlock pistol, and occasionally throw his stun bomb at you and continue to shoot you more after that. It's basically the Munakata boss fight, but without any of the bodyguards. So it's super easy to get the upper hand on him, and you'll quickly discover that you can end him in likely less than a minute, even with how much health he has. You don't feel any pressure or need to do any fancy moves or any counters or even heat actions. It's just a pathetically easy fight fitting for a character like him when you know the story of the game. Number 30, Tetsu, the final boss of Yakuza Dead Souls. Ah, Dead Souls, my beloved. This is a unique boss fight where you're at the top of the Millennium Tower because, of course you are, it's a Yakuza game, and you're fighting a giant mutated version of Tetsu, or the upper half of him at least. This fight is super easy. He'll occasionally do a couple of attacks that might take a bit to know how to dodge effectively, but really all you're doing here is just standing still, or almost standing still, and just opening fire on him. Kiryu's signature rifle already does a ton of damage as well, so you're gonna be be done with this fight super quickly, unless maybe you're out of ammo. The fight does have a bunch of really cool sequences and quick time events as well, so that's a bonus point for it. Honestly, the previous fight was way better and a little more creative, but yeah, difficulty-wise, definitely one of the easiest final bosses in the whole series. Number 29, Ibuchi, the final boss of the Majima saga in Yakuza Kiwami 2. I felt it wasn't a bad idea to include final bosses of the mini-campaigns, so here he is. So, the Majima saga doesn't have an upgrade system, meaning that ranking this fight is one of the most fair things you can do compared to every other fight, where the circumstances will greatly differ from player to player. He has Tamashiro's moveset, who is a boss in Yakuza 3 who wields a pistol at some point, and it's really not that special of a fight outside of the amazing dynamic intro. There's no quick time event whatsoever, and because of the limited moveset that he and you have, it's really not an eventful fight. Having said that, he has one annoying move that might be difficult to dodge out of, which is a grab that happens very quickly, which guarantees damage on you. And it's going to happen sooner or later because you kinda need to be close to him to damage him. Other than that though, it doesn't take much to take him down. Number 28, Ryuji, the final boss of Yakuza Kiwami 2 in particular. The first couple of Dragon Engine games were notorious for how powerful you can get in them without having to go out of your way, and it certainly shows here. You're easily able to upgrade your attack in Yakuza Kiwami 2 to the point where a couple of heat actions might be all it takes to wipe the floor with Ryuji. Though a few things he has going for him, especially if your attack stat isn't super upgraded, is the fact that he has hyper armor, and also the fact that attacks can just bounce off of him, which slows down your momentum a lot. But other than that, he's not too big of a threat, and you have a whole bunch of options other than just heat actions to try and do something about his hyper armor, like the charge attacks, which you can mix with your usual rush combo to deliver a decent amount of damage. I imagine most people didn't shy away from upgrading their attack stat going through this game, hence why I think this isn't too unfair of a placement. Number 27, Kiwami, the final boss of Yakuza 6. Little baby Kiwami himself. A big reason why he's down here is similar to Kiwami 2 Ryuji, where you can be so powerful in 6 that you'll end this fight in like half a minute. It is worth noting though that Kiwami does a surprising amount of damage, so you want to avoid being ambushed by him. Overall, there's not too much to this fight, so it's probably just best to move on to the next one. Number 26, Daigo, Kiryu's final boss of Yakuza 4. You fight Daigo as Kiryu in a game where he's very strong combat-wise, Kiryu that is, and on top of that, the damage you can deal in Yakuza 4 is almost comical. Even though Daigo has 3 HP bars, it feels like he has less than that because of the sheer amount of damage you can inflict in this game, much less as Kiryu. Daigo will eventually enter heat mode where he can catch you off guard by parrying your attacks, but it really isn't a big threat if you know how to play it safely. And even if you get caught a lot, you're not losing much because you can just get right back up and continue to annihilate him. We're talking about Yakuza 4, you really don't have to worry about much in this game. Number 25, Baba, Shinada's final boss in Yakuza 5. Baba is capable of doing a decent amount of damage to you, but unfortunately, Shinada has one of the best cheese methods in all of the franchise, and that is light attack, heavy attack, grab. You can literally do it until he gets to 1 HP, or maybe you don't want to do that, which is also fair, but it is an option you have. Generally speaking, even though Shinada has limited options compared to the other characters, he has quite a lot of heat actions, and the fact that he can do a lot of damage in Yakuza 5 also helps. Baba is very easy to dodge around and attack, so I think this is a good spot for him. Number 24, Kido, Saijima's final boss of Yakuza 4. This fight might actually change quite a bit depending on one single factor, whether or not you have a skill called Herculean Spirit. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a skill that basically gives you hyper armor in the middle of your attacking animations, so you'd be able to dish out a whole bunch of damage while ignoring everything the enemy is throwing at you, which, needless to say, makes Saijima an unstoppable monster. It's one of his best skills, and you absolutely always want to get it as soon as you can. This trivializes all fights for him, and Kido is included in that list. Kido himself has quite a bit of hyper armor, but that really doesn't matter when you yourself have the same thing. Compared to the other final bosses of Yakuza 4, Kido is unique in that he will regenerate some HP, but once again, it doesn't matter. You're just too powerful with Herculean Spirit. Now, if you don't have that ability, this fight still isn't that bad, especially if you try to make use of the charge attack hyper armor, but you're definitely liable to spending more time here because Saijima will flinch at any and all attacks without that skill. Number 23, Majima, Saijima's final boss in Yakuza 5. Even though Saijima is an absolute beast in Yakuza 5, more so than Yakuza 4, Majima can deliver a flurry of slashes your way that can damage you quite a bit, even when you have Herculean Spirit. But of course, it's more apparent when you don't have it. I think that compared to the Kido fight, having no Herculean Spirit in this fight is slightly more difficult. This fight is also littered with quick time events. They reuse every single one they had for him at this point, and then introduce a new one on top of that. He also has his infamous Shadow Clone technique debut in this game, which honestly isn't that big of a problem. We're at number 23 now, and honestly I still feel like we're going through a whole bunch of easy fights. So like I said in the beginning, don't take the placements too seriously because some of these are easily interchangeable depending on the circumstances. Number 22, Aizawa, Kiryu's final boss in Yakuza 5 and technically the last boss in that game. Even though Aizawa initially might cause you to worry a bit since he has plenty of colorful HP bars, Kiryu is broken beyond belief in this game, it's not even funny. This fight becomes an absolute joke to the point where you can basically decide the fate of the fight in the starting room, even though this fight spans across multiple areas. If you do the infamous bounding throw cheese, you can get him to 1 HP and just watch all the subsequent quick time events unfold like it's a movie, until you eventually get to the courtyard where he's gonna heal and then you have to damage him again. And let's assume the bounding throw cheese isn't used. It doesn't matter because Kiryu is still busted beyond belief without it. The Taiga drop is easier than ever to do in this game, especially after training. And if you have the food buffs unlocked, you can do a lot of damage whether it's normal attacks or heat actions. And you have a wide selection of both. Even though Kiryu enters this fight fatally wounded, Aizawa stood absolutely no chance. Number 21, Arai, Akiyama's final boss in Yakuza 4. I like Arai's fight quite a bit. He's not piss easy, but he's also not difficult. You can do some wall-bounding cheese that'll basically end the fight without him doing a single thing, maybe except for the quick time event. But I'd say that might be slightly easier to mess up compared to the Aizawa bounding throw cheese. Arai has 2 heat modes, blue and red. He can also parry you at times. If he's in red heat mode, you won't be able to wall-bound him anymore. He's not a complete brain-dead boss. Doing something like spamming attacks up front won't work because he'll basically dodge around you to interrupt you. So dodging and attacking from the back is one of your best options here. Number 20, Kanai, Akiyama's final boss in Yakuza 5. Kanai is a persistent guy who fights you multiple times in this game, but this time he starts with a knife that he integrates into his usual moveset, and then on top of that you have a whole bunch of thugs with him as well. Depending on how you approach this fight, it can be a little annoying. I usually prefer to clear the thugs first while trying to dodge Kanai at the same time. You really don't want them to get in the way of you trying to fight Kanai, which will only allow him to combo you easier. Once he's alone, you have a whole bunch of options, using the counter, dodging behind and attacking, heat actions, and so on. He's quite tanky for someone like Akiyama, but he's definitely not something you can't deal with. I think the fight has a very nice pace to it and flows very nicely as well. Much like Arai, it's not too difficult and it's not too easy. It's just somewhere in the middle, and I say that in the best way possible. Number 19, Shirakaba, the unassuming final boss of the Kaito files of Lost Judgment. This guy has a lot of moves from Yakuza 0's final boss, Shibusawa. He's not super hard hitting, but he has a whole bunch of health bars. And if you take him down to 0 HP, he will regenerate all of those health bars, extending the fight by quite a bit depending on how upgraded you are. Overall, it honestly feels like a glorified average boss fight more than an actual final boss. I think even someone like Kiwami dealt more damage to you, but Shirakaba has the advantage of just having more HP, I think. Number 18, Shibusawa, Kiryu's final boss in Yakuza 0. He's unique in that he has 3 different fighting styles that actually all have different animations. One that corresponds to Kiryu's Rush style, the other corresponding to Kiryu's Beast style, and finally the equivalent of Brawler or Legend style. In this game, even without limit breaking your attack damage in the Legend style, you can do so much damage. Kiryu's Brawler combo of triple light attack, heavy attack, and grab combo alone can take about half a boss's health bar. Shibusawa has multiple health bars, but they go by so quickly. This fight has multiple quote-unquote phases, and when you get to the phase where he uses the equivalent of Beast style, you can absolutely shred his health with all the tables and chairs laying around, before you get to the final phase where it's really not that much of a challenge either. It's a decent boss fight overall though. Number 17, Lao Gui, Majima's final boss in Yakuza 0. Lao Gui is a really cool boss, one of my favorites in the series. He's slightly more difficult than Shibusawa, I would say, mainly because he constantly uses weapons. Weapons that are capable of stunning you and thus leaving you vulnerable to taking even more damage. He uses claws, a saber, and a gun. And if you're not precise and careful with your attacks, he'll get a lot of hits in. Or you could just cheese him with the classic breaker combo if you choose. It's up to you. One of his quick time events is insanely quick on legend difficulty, which may just guarantee that you take that damage. But all in all, I do feel like Shibusawa is slightly easier than him, so yeah, Lao Gui would be here. Number 16, Bryce Fairchild. Ichiban's final boss in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, or Yakuza 8. I adore this fight so much. He's definitely the easiest final boss in the turn-based games so far, but that's not really saying much given that we only have 3 so far. A lot of how this fight will go depends on how prepared you are for it, but assuming you did what the game expected you to do and you're around the same level as the enemies here, you'll have a decent time. You won't suffer and you won't curb stomp. So Bryce's fight has 3 phases, 2 of which are with his cult members, and the final one has him join the fray. There are a bunch of things to look out for, one of those being moves where he'll do AoE attacks or throw a whole bunch of bombs at your party. But the funny thing about that is that he doesn't discriminate between allies and foes, he'll just damage everybody. You're probably not gonna do any panicking during this fight, but you're also probably not going to be able to get through it by just, doing normal attacks. You may need to stop and think about what you want your next move to be. Number 15, Munakata, Tanimura's final boss in Yakuza 4. Finally, here we are. This is a big one for reasons that I honestly wasn't intending to get into prior to doing a bit of research. According to, let's say, surveys in a couple of different social media outlets, I asked people who they thought was the hardest Yakuza boss in the series. And this math is not super precise, but just about 80% of people said Munakata. I was in absolute disbelief. This is a boss that I'm so used to fighting by now that I don't even think twice about any of the reasons people brought up for why they had trouble with him. In fact, I considered bumping him up in this list purely because I'm trying to combine not only my experience but also others as well. But no matter what, this list is bound to be imperfect because of how many layers there are to it. So moving away from that, Munakata is a gun boss with a bunch of bodyguards that will surround you. But he's actually very easy if you do 2 things. One of them is having the Sacred Tree armor, which automatically blocks bullets, and the second thing you can do to have an easier time, which doesn't require, material requirements, is spam grabbing the bodyguards, which gives you an insane amount of invincibility frames where you don't get harmed at all. Combine that with doing heat actions whenever possible, and you'll get through this fight without much issue at all. Having said that, this boss is annoying the more missteps you take, but I actually think there's a couple of really clever things to the fight that can really help you. For example, every time he's going to shoot at you, you get an audio cue from him which helps you dodge the bullets without even having to look at him. And once you have the timing down, dodging those bullets without the Sacred Tree armor isn't too difficult. I mean, you will likely get shot here and there because of, how many bodyguards you have around you, but it still helps a lot. I think having him placed here isn't too out of place. You can choose to take down all his bodyguards and then him, or the other way around. I personally find myself prioritizing him only after taking down the smaller bodyguards, because trying to deal with his elite bodyguard while he shoots at you is pretty annoying, especially without the Sacred Tree armor. From what I've seen, many people struggled here because they just weren't prepared enough. I think if you have an inventory full of heals, you really don't have to worry about much. I think many people underestimate Tanimura's crowd control potential with his grab. It has a much wider range compared to other protagonists, and you'll damage multiple opponents at the same time. You're also gonna gain a lot of heat doing this. So yeah, Munakata's annoying, but you can definitely do things that will make him much easier to deal with. Number 14, Nishiki, the final boss of Yakuza Kiwami in particular. I think Nishiki is definitely a tougher fight compared to Shibusawa and Lao Gui as well, especially if you played this game and you didn't make the time to upgrade your dragon style, which admittedly can take quite a while thanks to Majima everywhere. As many of you know, Kiwami has a boss system where they can regenerate health mid-fight unless you interrupt them with a specific finisher or any heat action. Nishiki will require the dragon style finisher, which if I remember right, might take a while for you to actually grind for. So the next best option would be to use a heat action to interrupt that. I think he uses the health regen for a total of 3 times, and depending on how much you allow him to heal, this fight might take a minute. However, Kiryu is also insanely powerful in this game, especially if you made the time to, train his dragon style. He has the iconic Taiga drop, which can just destroy any boss in general. Kiryu in this game is arguably more powerful than he is in Yakuza 0, so if you know what you're doing, Nishiki really isn't that big of a problem. Number 13, Nozaki Ryo, the final boss of Kurohyou 2. Maybe I was overprepared, or maybe it's just Kurohyou 2 being Kurohyou 2. I kid you not, this final boss is probably easier than an average street encounter with a Yakuza-type enemy in the late game. Having said that, there's still a few things that make this fight fairly challenging. He has an AoE aura wave attack, which honestly is kind of weird for an action game that focuses on grit and more grounded combat, but you're able to dodge it by running away in time or by doing a charged attack on him at the right time. Other than that, he honestly isn't that difficult, especially if you're using a quick style that has a lot of multi-fast hits. Bosses in Kurohyou 2 also have a state of exhaustion indicated by a teal-colored aura, where their aggression is greatly reduced and they're way less likely to do things like counter you, so you can really go in with the punches and kicks without having to worry. And again, if your style is fast enough, you're probably not going to stop attacking for a while. Generally speaking, the bosses in the Kurohyou games are absolute sponges. Like, you wouldn't believe it if you were to play these games for the first time. So even if you're maxed out, these bosses will still take a few minutes to beat. Now try to imagine not being maxed. You're gonna stay in these fights for potentially up to 20 minutes and maybe beyond, depending on the difficulty, which I think is a bit much. Also, before we move on, he has one of the most hyped tracks in the whole series. Go check it out. It's called Born to be Wild, and it's wild. Number 12, Ebina. Kiryu's final boss in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. Even though Ebina fights you by himself as opposed to Bryce, which makes you think it might be an easier fight because you don't have to worry about numbers, that can be a bit deceiving. Ebina has a whole bunch of area-wide moves that can deal a lot of damage and also status effects to your party. If you come unprepared, you'll pay the price for it. But we're assuming you're at least at the level they want you to be, if not higher. He'll eventually transition into a phase where he'll grab a katana, which gives him even more AoE potential. The status effects he inflicts can be annoying to deal with as well. Though honestly, even on my first playthrough, I didn't have too much trouble against him, but I have heard from people that have. Then again, I took my sweet time leveling up and all that, so yeah, there's that. Number 11, Targa, the final boss of Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise. Targa is a very fun fight, but also one that will greatly change depending on how prepared you are for it. See, Lost Paradise has a system where it works very close to turn-based and JRPG games, where if your level isn't close to the enemies you're fighting, you're in for a bad time. You'll take a crap ton of damage and you won't deal that much yourself. So if you're under-leveled, you're likely going to suffer. But as I said in the beginning of the list, we'll assume that you're prepared, or you have most of the combat tools on hand. And in that case, this fight really isn't all that bad. Making use of dodging and dodge attacks in general will be very handy here. It's also worth mentioning that there's a quick time event that is actually quite lengthy, where you're going to deal damage to him. And then, if you also did your training with Toki, there is a point in the fight where Targa's going to jump into the air, and you'll have a prompt to do a specific secret technique that will do quite a bit of damage on him. So in a very weird way, this fight feels a bit more scripted than your average boss fight, but only if you choose to go down that route. You might be wondering, what if we're talking about the canon difficulty? And it really isn't that different, assuming you're, ready for that as well. In that difficulty, he'll be level 99 and he will have a purple/pink HP bar, signifying having more HP compared to the other difficulties, where he has a blue HP bar. He'll dodge around a lot, but it's really nothing he can't handle if you also do the same thing. Number 10, Reiji Shinjo, the final boss of Kurohyou 1. I found this guy to have a bit more to him compared to Nozaki Ryo when it comes to trying to deal with some of his moves. In Kurohyou 1, you don't have that teal-colored heat boss exhaustion state. Wow, that's a mouthful. So that means you're more likely to get countered at all times. And this guy will counter you sometimes. He has a move or two that will make use of the empty space as well. One of which is him chasing after you much quicker than any other enemy will, trying to push you to the edge of the arena. If he gets into this state, I don't think you can outrun him. You can avoid this by trying to keep your distance whenever he gets into his heat mode until he gets out of it. Also, just like Nozaki Ryo, the tankiness of this boss applies especially if you're not maxed out and if you're on the highest difficulty. Even if you're maxed out, this guy will take at least several minutes to beat. Overall, not super difficult. Maybe on the first playthrough he's pretty difficult. But honestly, even when you know what's up, he's not a complete pushover. Number 9, Kuwana, the final boss of Lost Judgment. Kuwana is a fairly challenging boss that'll deal a good amount of damage to you even with his normal jabs. He's pretty agile and will dodge around, counter you, and even do the air jumps that Yagami himself can do. Having said that, you have a ton of tools yourself to deal with all of that in Lost Judgment, the easiest of which is just the attack upgrades, since this is a Dragon Engine game. Though even with the attack upgrades, you gotta watch how often you get hit, especially if you used up a lot of heals coming into this fight. There's a lot of fights before this one, so yeah. Number 8. Shishido, the final boss of Like a Dragon Gaiden, the man who erased his name. So here's the thing. Ranking this guy was kinda tricky, but honestly a lot of this list is. You must have already noticed this pattern of just how many variables there can be with this series. It actually makes the creation of this video so difficult, and there's bound to be contradictions or just, differences in experiences between me and you. But, setting all that aside, this is a Dragon Engine game, which means he could be one of the easiest fights on the list or one of the harder ones depending on how much you upgrade your attack. But Shishido has something that bosses like Kiwami and Kiwami 2 Ryuji don't, and that is an attack with a katana that may as well be insta-kill if you're not above half HP. And it's very quick as well, or at least quicker than the usual mortal attacks that you see coming from a mile away in comparison. Basically, you don't want to be locked into an animation that will leave you open to it. A lot of the Dragon Engine final bosses can do fairly powerful attacks, but they pale in comparison to how much damage Shishido can deal to you. And if you're not attentive enough, he can end you before you even realize anything was wrong. For this alone, I think this spot is fair, even though you can make quick work of him if you have high attack power. Shishido reminds me a bit of OG2 Ryuji, which we'll get to later, where attacking him can make him retaliate very aggressively, tanking a lot of your hits while dealing damage back simultaneously. So even if you have high attack power and health, you have to be on the lookout for his deadly attacks, especially in the highest difficulty. Number 7. Tendo. Technically the final boss of Yakuza Like a Dragon. Tendo is the definition of a beast. Facing this guy was like running into a literal wall for many people playing for the first time, and even on revisits, he'll probably take a good amount of time to actually beat. He's resistant to a lot of types of skills. He's a tank more than he is a damage dealer, but he does have some insta-kills that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Peerless Resolve, my beloved. This guy taught many people the importance of using Ichiban's Peerless Resolve at the beginning of a tough fight, just in case he dies. Because as many of you know, if he dies, it's game over for everyone and you have to restart the whole fight. Unfortunately, there will be moments in the fight where Tendo will specifically target Ichiban, so you definitely want to use it as soon as the fight starts. Overall, a pretty good time. Number 6. Nishiki, the final boss of Yakuza 1 on the PlayStation 2. Nishiki is much more challenging in the original for probably the wrong reasons, or at least partly. It might be expected, but this is the very first Yakuza game, so the gameplay is pretty rough compared to pretty much every other game. On top of that, weird hitboxes, enemy iframes, and hyper armor is off the charts in this game at times. And that is certainly the case with the Nishiki fight. In his heat state, you literally don't get an indication that you're damaging him when you attack. You make no sound when your hits connect, and he doesn't flinch at all. But you see his HP going down, so that's something, I guess. He only has 2 HP bars, which aren't too bad to go through whenever he's not in his heat state. There's a bunch of quick time events during this fight, and even a heat action he can do on you. Even if you don't have the Kamaki moves, you should manage without too much trouble aside from the annoyances. Coming into this fight, you will probably have used a bunch of heals against Jingu and the guys working for him, but luckily they scatter a bunch of heals even in the arena you fight Nishiki in. Overall, pretty challenging, a bit of bullshit sprinkled in, but you won't rip your hair out in frustration. Probably. Number 5. Mine, the final boss of Yakuza 3. Mine is quite a difficult boss compared to many others. He has multiple heat modes that indicate different moves he'll be able to do. Now, this being Yakuza 3, this fight could take a while the higher difficulty you're playing on, as the damage you deal drastically decreases. Mine is very agile, dodging around constantly and has dodge attacks, though he isn't too difficult to counter if you have the Kamaki moves. They help a lot here, but I'd argue you can do it very well even without them. Stuff like dodging behind him is a viable strategy, at least when he's not in any particular heat mode. So he has blue, orange, and red heat modes. Blue is the one where he's going to heal, which he can actually counter with the Kamaki parry and put a stop to it. And then you have the orange heat mode where he'll do a bunch of multi-hits that are tricky to react to. And finally, the red heat mode is the strangest one to me. To my knowledge, not even the Kamaki counters can save you from this one. He will basically go berserk, having hyper armor, constantly unleashing attacks, and he'll do much more damage in this state. They literally made a mechanic that you can't do anything against except keep your distance or run away until it fades. And to this day, I don't know if this is good design or bad design. Sometimes after his red heat mode, a quick time event will happen where you will deal damage to him and you gain some heat on top of that, which is nice. Speaking of heals, you can carry about 20 in this game and you'll find a bunch of them in the long fight before this, so it's not much of an issue. As far as bosses go, Mine is one of the more difficult ones, but not bullshit levels of difficult. He feels very fair as you have multiple options against him, even when he has a mechanic you literally can't do anything against. Number 4. Kuroiwa, the final boss of Judgment. Kuroiwa is an amazing boss fight. In my opinion, probably the most difficult Dragon Engine final boss, though partly because of the jank of the first Judgment game. Even when you're close to fully upgraded, the damage this guy can do to you is no joke, and puts even Shishido to shame. On top of that, he can juggle you around like he's playing Tekken, and can even do the wall attacks that you are able to do. As a lot of bosses, he has the occasional hyper armor, so using the Tiger Drop will be very useful here. Wall attacks are the next best thing to stagger him. Even if you have all the attack upgrades, he will drain your HP and heals very quick if you don't watch your steps. All in all, a very solid boss fight difficulty-wise and a super fun one. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, when you defeat him, he comes back in the coolest way possible, back with full HP. Wow. Number 3. Takechi, the final boss of RGG Ishin, the original. Even though this is not a Dragon Engine game, this is a big case where your equipment and upgrades can heavily affect how this fight goes, mainly because how central equipment are to this game compared to others. Generally speaking though, I had a very trying time with this fight back when I played it, but it was also mainly my fault because my equipment could have been better. This game also does have things like, boss hyper armor, which, only makes things more fun. Not. You also go through a huge segment before this, which may take a lot of your heals. Even though you have more inventory slots compared to Yakuza 3, 4, and 5, you'll quickly use those heals because of how much damage you may take here. This fight has 3 different phases as well, where it starts with a sword duel, then it goes into a wild dancer phase, where Takechi can now attack you from a distance, and then finally it goes back to just being a sword fight. Heat actions in this game deal okay damage when you first do them, and then repeat heat actions are infinitely more pathetic in damage compared to games like Yakuza 3, 4, 5. Not that you need heat actions if you have a good sword anyway, but yeah, it was worth mentioning. I'm not sure if I'm in the minority with this, but I just have plenty of other fights that I like better than this one. Number 2. Takechi, the final boss of Like a Dragon Ishin, or RGG Ishin Kiwami as it's called in Japan. Do you like more hyper armor sprinkled on your hyper armor? Well, here you go. It's basically the same thing as the original Takechi, except slightly more cheap and uninspired. Other than that, he's able to do one of those card moves on you that deals a lot of damage, but once again, not a big fan. Okay, before we get to number 1, I know a lot of you deep down were thinking about one particular dude. I'm going to indulge all of you, even though he's not a final boss, but he may have felt more like a final boss compared to the actual final boss in his game. And so, here's an honorable mention to the Jingu fight in Yakuza Kiwami in particular. I legitimately thought this may have been the hardest story boss fight in the entire series by far at one point. And even now, to an extent, I still think he's at least one of the harder boss fights in the whole series. Even if you're fully upgraded with all the dragon style moves, you're likely still going to get curb stomped at least a little bit. This guy has homing grenades that track your movement, which makes absolutely no sense. He's much more vicious as a gun boss compared to Munakata, and to top it all off, he has 2 competent bodyguards, which may seem like a downgrade compared to Munakata, who has many more of them, but I'm sure many of you understand exactly how annoying Jingu's bodyguards are, even though they're smaller in numbers. So you have a whole buffet of annoying enemies where all of them are equally annoying that you don't know which one to go for first. Oh wait, Jingu's not the only one with a gun here, by the way. His bodyguards both also have pistols, and all 3 of them will happily pull the trigger on you again and again and again. Having to deal with 3 guns is already a nightmare on its own. And don't forget about Jingu's hand grenades. Now, here's another thing. You take down both guards, and they will come back. I want to jump off of a okay, maybe that's an exaggeration. I honestly can manage against them way better than on my first few playthroughs, but I have not forgotten how torturous this fight can be. So technically, you're dealing with a total of 4 boss-type bodyguards and Jingu. If you don't have the Kamaki moves, especially the Tiger Drop, this fight will probably make you want to quit the game. Unless maybe you're using weapons, which is also a viable option. I also forgot to mention that, this game being built off of the Yakuza 0 engine, the guns will constantly stun you, allowing you to take even more damage. It's so annoying. The Kamaki moves will help you a lot here. You could end the fight relatively quick. The funniest thing about this fight is that its original counterpart on the PS2 is nowhere near as difficult as this hot piece of garbage. Well, I say hot piece of garbage, but I think the fight in a twisted way was a nice change of pace on hindsight. Not saying it's a good fight, but it's different. But yeah, the original fight was so much easier, you could just go for Jingu easily and end it all very quickly. And now, for what I think is the hardest final boss in the whole Yakuza series. Number 1. Ryuji, The final boss of the original Yakuza 2 in particular. You might be looking at this placement thinking, wow, I didn't know Leon liked this fight so much. Sometimes, being the hardest boss in a franchise isn't necessarily a good thing. This list isn't listing the best fights, it's just the hardest fights. And it doesn't matter whether they're cheap or not. Sometimes a challenge is less of a challenge and more of the game throwing every possible thing you might dislike about a boss fight into a blender, mixing all of them into a singular boss fight, which technically does create a challenge where you might have to approach the fight much more differently compared to the conventional boss fight, and to this day, this remains true. The original fight against Ryuji in Yakuza 2 is one of the most annoying and likely the hardest one in the series that I've had the displeasure of experiencing for me even today. Let me explain what makes this fight so unforgiving, for better or worse. As many of you know, you go through many fights leading up to the final Ryuji fight. You go through the entirety of the Jingun Mafia as you make your way from Serena to Kamurocho Hills, facing some mini-bosses along the way like Man in Black. Then you get the first Ryuji boss fight in the finale where he has his katana, and then after that you deal with Terada, his submachine gun, and his thugs. Only after that you actually get to the final Ryuji fight where by this point there may be a chance you've used up all of your heals. And I mean more so than the other games. And the thing about OG Yakuza 2 and also Yakuza 1 is that you're able to carry only 9 healing items. Only 9. That sounds absolutely insane when you compare it to later games like 3, 4, 5 where you can carry 20, or even the Dragon Engine games where you can carry a whole store in your pocket. Now if you didn't go through everything you need to do to get the Komaki moves, then honestly, God help you in this fight. Ryuji is capable of retaliating even if a singular hit lands on him. Multi-hits are absolutely out of the question. Oh, you thought Yakuza 3 was bad? You're going to chip damage your way out of here without the Tiger Drop. Ryuji also has a bunch of iframes in some of his moves, and everybody's favorite mechanic, Hyper Armor. Everybody loves that, right? Well, you get a whole bunch of it here. The typical dodging behind him to combo, as far as I remember, doesn't really work either because that doesn't stop his retaliation or counter-attacking. This is literally like having the Hakuho clan captain from Yakuza 3 as the final boss, but just give him even more annoying things to deal with. One of the strangest things to me is whenever people talk about the topic of hyper armor ruining later games, but conveniently leave out insanely annoying instances from earlier games or their favorite games, claiming it's not as bad, or as if taking your time and keeping your distance with the Dragon Engine bosses is bad there, but not here. Then again, maybe it's because only 5% of the fanbase actually experienced this fight. So, let's see what we have here. Immediate counter-attacking, very limited heals, hyper armor, iframes, dodge attacks, questionable hitboxes, an insane reliance on counters. Oh, and I forgot to mention, health regeneration. He'll recover a bit of HP sometime later into this fight. This is the miracle mix. Absolute peak. Everything that people love about Yakuza boss fights is right here. I genuinely think people should actually go back and re-experience this fight purely for the experience. Some people may have forgotten how atrocious this fight is, or maybe some people haven't even seen it. So I implore both categories. Literally play Yakuza 2, download a save just for this fight. And don't look up no damage strats. Do this with your own smarts and see how well it goes. Do it once with the use of Komaki moves and the second time without, and tell me how that goes. Please. I'm waiting. And with this, we have made it to the end of the video. I want to once again stress, a lot of these placements can be interchangeable depending on the circumstances and the experience one may have had compared to someone else. But for me, I feel like these are probably roughly where they should be. I said it multiple times throughout the video, but Yakuza is really hard to talk about in a subject matter like this just because of how many things can change your experience with the combat and the boss fights. Many of these bosses can become some of the easiest fights provided, you've done the right things to make it that way. I didn't even account for using weapons, which people out there may do, but I personally prefer not to. Games like Ishin and Kenzan are obvious exceptions since they revolve around using weapons. Some people may prefer not to have attack damage upgrades, others will go ham on that stuff and not care. And once again, the experiences those two will have will be very different. I just hope that, coming out of this video, we all understand that at least. I thought this video would be a fun thing to talk about, and it might even create discussions that would be very fun to get into. So if you have any questions about my placements, or if you even want to share your experience with something that greatly differed from my list, by all means, means, please go ahead. Maybe you found Tenkai to be the hardest boss fight ever and OG2 Ryuji to be the easiest thing ever. Who knows? But anyway, I want to say thank you all so much for giving the channel and this video the time of your day. It really means a lot to me whenever you sit down and just hear me yap about Yakuza or anything in general. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if it isn't too much to ask, a like and a sub would help me out immensely. Also, I want to say that probably sometime after this video, I'll start doing streams of different Yakuza games until we get to Pirate Yakuza's release date. So if you want a place to hang out until then, please drop by in my streams. I'd be more than happy to have you and maybe we can chat. Anyway, you guys take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye now.